Our Highline Voices, 106.5 KQWZ LP FM. Connecting Highline and our region. Share your story. Our Highline Voices, history, cultural heritage, art, performances, contemporary, pop culture. We are very motivated to provide a vibrant community museum and authentic social gathering place. It truly takes a village to raise a museum. Despite the challenges, our daily inspiration is our eagerness to build a stronger and more connected community. This museum is from the community to the community. Our passion is for our visitors to have access to a broad spectrum of information sources and cultural perspectives. Our Highline Voices.
Hi everyone, welcome back. This is Nancy from the Highline Heritage Museum, and we are excited to have our next guest today. Austin, he is, in my mind, in my opinion, a very interesting and cool person, and I'm just so happy to have him here. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm gonna let him introduce himself, but I just want to say thank you for allowing us to do this interview, but also wanted to explain why are we doing this. We're doing this as an opportunity for us to share people's stories, for us to do it outside of the museum walls. We are really excited to explore not just doing exhibits and programs, but also reaching out to audiences that don't have accessibility. For example, people that work many jobs or have transportation issues or have disabilities, or people that just don't trust museums in general. And so the idea of little by little just sharing the stories outside of the museum walls is something that we really find it interesting and rewarding. We've been getting a lot of really nice feedback about that. And Austin is our board member. He's the president of a board. So I'm glad that we can share that too. And I'm going to let him explain more about that. But in the meantime, thank you for joining us today. And Austin, welcome to the space.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here again. Yeah, I am Austin Bell, Burien resident, UW graduate, former council member, and current board president here at the museum.
Nice. So tell us more about you, Austin. Who are you? Why here in Burien? Who are you? Your family? What makes you you?
So yeah, I'm only 33, but my family has been here for a long time. I thought I would share a little bit about their story today and how that ties into Highline history. I think I'd start with my great-grandfather, who was actually born up in Canada, up in Nova Scotia. He left there to actually work in the mines down in Mexico. He was a engineer who worked on the water pumps down in Mexico and some of the mines there around the turn of the century. He ended up having to leave during some of the, I believe, one of the revolutions down there, some of the political turmoil. I've heard different versions of the story. Sometimes Grandpa would tell the story that he stole a boat and, snuck across the border. Other versions were a little bit more tamer than that, so hard to say. But he ends up in Los Angeles, California, where he meets his wife. My great-grandfather meets his wife and has children, including my grandfather, Malcolm Bell. He works there for a while, actually, on the early Hollywood days, building sets in Hollywood, learns to be a carpenter, ends up leaving there to move up here. His wife's family owned a hardware store in downtown Seattle in the early days. Moves right here to Old Burien, which at the time was, of course, just a small little lakeside community, oftentimes a lot of summer homes and what have you, still kind of building. The streetcar, I think, would have only recently kind of come in around that time. I'm not even sure if it would have been in yet, but this is sort of around the Great Depression era. He moves here with his family and actually continues to work as a carpenter. Some of the homes that he builds in this area, up in the Gregory Heights area, still stand today. Some of the older houses were built by my great-grandfather, with sometimes in the summer, occasionally the help of my grandfather. I've seen a couple of them. I forget exactly where all of them are. Jumping forward a little bit, my grandfather, Malcolm Bell, he was brought into the service during World War II, as so many in his generation were. He was trained to be a forward artillery observer, but ends up getting to remain in the country to train others. They thought he did a good enough job, or I think his math skills were above average for those days, and so he remained to train After the war, goes to law school at the University of Washington. He said in his class was Bill Gates Sr. This is, of course, before the Gates family was big, but he was a fellow pupil of my grandfather. Where it starts tying into Highline history, after law school, he continues to live here in Burien. I like to say that for the last 100 years, there's always been a Bell living in Burien. Uh, of course, at this time, the city was unincorporated. It was just a community around the lake. There was a community club, the Burien Community Club or Lake Burien Community Club, and many of their members were really interested in the idea of Burien becoming a city, of incorporating and becoming a municipality. Normandy Park incorporates, I think, around this time. This is in the 50s, but Burien and SeaTac are still unincorporated areas. So they go to the voters and they have a ballot initiative and they're going to have a vote on incorporating as a city. And at the same time they decide to do this, they want to be up and running if the voters so agree. So they also have an election for city council and mayor. And as I found in the newspaper clippings in our archives here at the museum, the way they would do it then is everyone would just run for city council. Whoever got the most votes, top 5 vote getters, I think, were on the council. Whoever got the most votes gets mayor. My grandfather, a young guy fresh out of law school, decides to run for the council, gets elected, gets the most votes, gets elected mayor, but the voters decide not to incorporate it as a city. So he becomes the first mayor of Burien that does not exist.
Oh my God.
Now I found out though he was part of the campaign that was opposed to it at the time, so he was very happy about this outcome actually, because and I think it was 2-1 or 3-1 or maybe even 4-1, a pretty large majority of the community at the time didn't want to incorporate. And the boundaries at this time would have been much smaller. It was kind of more around the core downtown of Burien and the lake. The newspaper articles I've found from it in our archives, you can see the letters to the editor back and forth and the conversations they had back in those days. And a lot of it had to do with questions about, bonding and stuff like that. There were some questions about, was this a tax revolt? But then at the same time, the community did vote in favor of tax levies at the time. But in any case, the city does not incorporate at that time. My grandfather did remain here his entire life. Ended up being appointed a judge or a judge pro tem in this district. He always bragged one of his cases, which was kind of a big hot button issue at the time when we start getting into the Vietnam War era. Someone was arrested because they had a flag on their car and they were American flag that they flew upside down as a way of protesting general political climate in the war at the time. They got arrested for flag desecration was the crime. It goes before my grandfather and he rules that no, this is actually a First Amendment issue and gets the guy off. It gets appealed. The case ends up getting dropped. A very similar case, though, pops up somewhere else in the country and actually goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ends up ultimately ruling the same way that my grandfather had earlier, that, yeah, this is a freedom of speech thing. But it just kind of shows you the time period that we were in, where these were the questions being had, and there was a lot of political animosity going on. So he remains a judge. My father also grew up in this area. Him and my grandfather both went to Highline High School, which a building that stood up until very recently was only recently remodeled. My own story with Burien, a lot of my life as a childhood was actually lived outside of the city, but would come here and visit my grandfather a lot. I remember going to the German deli, which is still there on 148, and we'd get the little German chocolates, and it was always so exciting for me. I ended up moving here more towards 17, 18 years old and, going to college, went to Highline Community College, went to University of Washington, where I got a degree in political science, also studied urban planning, public administration. But then at the age of 24, I decided to run for Burien City Council. And the voters were so kind as to give a young man a chance. And I served on the Burien City Council for 4 years. 2 of those years were as deputy mayor, which in our system, for those who don't know, the council chooses from amongst itself a mayor and deputy mayor to be basically presiding and co-presiding officers of the council. Since then, I decided not to seek another term. I like to say I retired at a young age out of politics. Since then, I've been managing a local mid-century modern furniture store here in Burien. We focus on a lot of stuff from the 50s, 60s, including some modern stuff, but it is fun because it gets me, not only do I get to see the community every day and interact with a lot of great people, and I get to live and work right here in downtown Burien, which has just been rapidly growing in the last, 10 years, incredible change. But I also get to interact with some very old and historical pieces and learn a lot about the history. Every now and then we find pieces that were, built here in Washington in the mid-century or in Oregon. I have this beautiful bar cart, which I just love, from a company called BP John, which was this German immigrant at the turn of the century, worked in the logging industry, as so many did back then, became really good with machines. So he ends up just building a furniture company when he retires out in Portland, in the neighborhood that's called John's Landing, was named after his furniture company because back in those days, this is of course where the trees would come from. They would log up in the Cascade Mountains, float them down the river, and just pull the logs out at John's Landing in Portland, drag them up into the furniture factory, cut them up, and then that's how the people in this area were able to have affordable, good quality furniture early on, back, before we became much more tied into the global trade networks that we are now. And now, Seattle sits at the hub of all international commerce, but back then it was much more locally produced. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and my family.
No, this is fascinating. It's intriguing actually too to see different layers of your family. All the way from you got me there. Even Mexico, you mentioned Mexico, like
Yeah.
whoa, like okay, that's a different take. I wasn't expecting that, and then going into the history, American history. You go into the Depression era, you go to World War I, World War II, and then what we are. You're talking about furniture, and I know that the mass production of anything took place after World War II, and so that's when you see those big factories really mass producing things. Before that, there was the individual craft person really doing a lot of really aesthetic work. That kind of disappears a little bit after World War II. You can see in the architecture, you can see it in the designs of furniture, you can see in designs of clothing and essentials around us, how the craft element is kind of gone. But then it takes place to the different dynamics in a society, in a culture right now. I'm glad that you share a little bit about your family in politics and how connected you are to your family in through generations, and how you've been serving the community, you and your family. And so that's been great to be able to hear that, and I'm glad that you shared this with all of us. um, Austin has been amazing to work with. He As an example, I don't know when you started to be a board member here at the museum,
You
but I
know,
know it was around the opening, I think.
it was right before the opening. It's been nearly 5 years now that the
Mm-hmm.
museum's been opening, and I hope everyone comes and celebrates with us on our fifth anniversary.
Mm-hmm.
I recall, yeah, it was shortly before the museum was still, I remember right after being joining the board, we were still installing some stuff
Mm-hmm.
here, and I remember helping hang the DB Cooper exhibit and trying to get the archive doors to work. I think that maybe my first meeting or second meeting of the board is when we actually set the date for our grand opening. So it was
Wow.
right around that time, a little over 5 years ago.
Wow. Well, it has been a pleasure to be working with you, and you've seen the transition and transformation. Um, It was not an easy period. It was pretty interesting to go to that transition from historical society to museum, moving the collections, opening, and to actually function as such, because we had no history doing it like that. I mean, we have no history in programming or physical services and all the different layers of what it is to run a museum. And so this has been an interesting. And then right after that, COVID hit, which
Yeah.
is a completely different challenge. 6 months, once we opened, 6 months later, COVID hit us, and only one third of museums in America did not survive. The fact that we did, somehow we did it, and I think that is because of all the different partnerships and collaborations and support that we got. I keep saying this over and over and over. It doesn't take one person; it takes a community to make it happen. And I'm always going to be making sure that it's clear it is a community doing this work. The element that got me, and as we continue to do through the opening, through COVID, and now we enter into to this new phase of thriving and growing and the opportunities. And then so working right next to you through those transitions has been amazing. And I know that the local history, even though I was not born and raised in the area, I was the curator collection for, I don't know, 16 years before becoming the director or something like that. And so I invested a large part of my life already into preserving the history of the area and the artifacts and the stories. And I'm always, even though I'm not from here, I'm find it very intriguing. The fact that you share that your grandfather built houses. Oh, he was a carpenter. Your great grandfather actually did that. And knowing that you're walking around and yep, my family was part of it, was part of the movement of building the community, was part of the movement of actually, extending buildings. And then you're right, around 1930s, this community was really interesting. In contrast to the rest of the country, one, it was pretty self-sufficient. You look into cities like Seattle or New York or LA where they don't have enough farming, they don't have enough, produce and things. This area, this region was really self-sufficient. That's why you see a lot of chicken farms around the area and the logging industry, which connects with the furniture too. And then it just how rich this area was to actually. I'm not saying there was no struggles. I'm not saying there was no ahead during the Depression era, but it was not as bad as a lot of the states around the country. It was really, really, really bad. Here, it was ways that you can grow your own vegetables, you can have your own produce taking place, you can get your own milk and eggs, and then just do it on your own, and then sharing in the community. This to me, the history of this community has been so intriguing too.
Yeah, and and also I think that I think that aspect of the culture kind of lives on. There is, for an urbanized area, you do see, and it's true, I think of Seattle and surrounding areas too, but you do see a lot of people really love to still have their backyard chicken coops. And I recall when I got elected, I think the first like controversial vote I had to take, where it was like, like a 5-4 split, and I was the swing vote, was a ordinance on the number of goats you're allowed to have within the city limits of Burien.
Wow.
That because there's a lot of people in our community, especially kind of up in the north part of Burien where you still have a little bit larger lot sizes. People like to have their goats and their chickens, and they, even though they're working, modern 9-to-5 jobs as well, they like to also have this kind of idea of some self-sufficiency and some sort of do-it-yourself aspects that have it, as you said, been part, early on because we're so isolated, we had to have that and allowed us to kind of weather the depression perhaps. And then even today, that kind of culture continues on. And I don't know if you see that as much in other communities.
Seattle was built around 1850s. You see people migrating to this area in 1870s. That's when you see a lot of community development taking place. Nomadic Park was a little different. It was a fence in that area, but around, where you see SeaTac and Y Center and, Des Moines and Burien. And so I think that it's not really that many generations apart. It's not really that much of a history. There's been times when I've gone to conference in the East Coast and we're looking at 1600s and 1700s, 1800s. We are into late 1800s. And so how many generations kind of fit within 100 years? Really not that many.
Right.
And you say you're right, that it's been the last 100 years, it's been at least one member of your family living in the area. So that is how young this community is in contrast to the rest of the planet. I mean, I grew up in a place where we were looking at, 1300s and 1400s. And so so the history changes dramatically from there.
Oh,
But going back to what you were saying about the first ordinance that you had to vote on, that's another element about what I love about this community, that it is the sense of self-sufficiency, and then now going into the environmental and even health, like you don't want to be, there's more and more studies and there's more education about the ramifications of eating meat and this and that. I'm not advocating for anything. All I'm just saying there's a lot of information out there. And it's an ongoing conversation with my family because my husband is vegetarian and he's always been his whole life, and he's a chef. And so it's like, Me as a Mexican, I grew up with meat, and so it's been always an interesting conversation. But now we're into, okay, what is the healthy lifestyle? And I think that people that, to me, it's not much about surviving anymore. It's more about self-sufficient, but having a better quality of life, having a better quality of taking decisions on their own health. I mean, you see more organic markets open up, organic milk or organic eggs or organic produce and things like that. How I know that you said that you went to urban planification, and so it is very interesting how everything ties in into how you serve in the community, but you also went to school for that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think it all ties back into, we were talking about how just that change from, pre-World War II to after World War II, when everything kind of becomes more about factoring and factories and mass production. And when it comes to things like, furniture, stuff like that, like I was talking about, it's really great because now everyone can have access to high quality stuff and furnish their homes. It's not just for the elite who get to have a sideboard or a nice dresser because it was handcrafted for them. Now we've kind of democratized that. On the other side of that coin is, are we not being as careful as we should be with things like food production? Are we just mass producing for the sake of what's most profitable, not thinking long term about what is healthiest? So there's two sides to that. By mass producing food, are we able to make it, more affordable and solve that nutrition gap and make sure that everyone's being fed as best we can? Are we going too far and not being careful enough with the way we're doing food? And I think this is something we have to think about with a lot of our stuff and how we look back at the past. And you start to bring up urban planning, which I studied, and we see that also in the way we urban plan. We built, this Burien itself started out as a streetcar suburb. In modern times, America is very much built around the automobile, and our street systems are very much built around the automobile. And that allowed people to get around really fast, and everyone has a car, and we can, shoot downtown. But on the flip side of that now is we're dealing with congestion. We're dealing with the health ramifications of all these cars, with their exhaust, car accidents, pedestrian fatalities. There's always this sort of balance between progress and trying to produce as much as we can and making sure that we're doing it in a thoughtful, healthy way. And one thing about being at the museum and looking back at the past, it really, I think, emphasizes the importance of looking forward to the future. And you see sometimes in our history, people really looking forward towards the future and leaving a legacy for us to now get to enjoy. And sometimes you look at the past and you see short-sightedness and you say, how could they have been so foolish to have not realized the impacts this would have in the future? And I certainly always hope that we're trying to be conscious of that and we're thinking about how we're going to impact the future. And I think part of that is remembering our stories from the past and seeing that and remembering to think in multi-generations.
Yeah, the preservation, what does that mean, has been interesting. I'm going to remove the human element for a moment, and it's just going to bring artifacts just alone. I can, working with collections for this many years has allowed me to have a really clear experience on preservation. For example, I can tell when things were done after the 1950s by the condition of the artifacts versus things that were done before that. Why? Because the ones that before that, they actually last longer than the ones that it was because of the mass production element. There's more chemicals involved. There's more a different type of process. There's more of a mindset of disposable type of thing. Back then, it was more, it's going to stay. We're going to do an iron thing. We're going to do this big chunk of wood thing. And there's a mindset of long term to just be able to last longer, those artifacts. And even like a newspaper, for example, newspaper is something that you produce daily. Well, now we're going into more about digital, but before it was very common, and it still is in some houses, to have the paper every day. And when you receive them, it is harder for me to preserve the newspaper that is produced today that it was produced 100 years from now.
Yeah.
Because of the fragility of things are not as steady as it is more, things are more fragile now than it was back then. And so when we think about preservation, not just artifacts, but now personal stories and human memories. And I believe a future in preserving the future is actually preserving the present. what's happening right now. Why? Because tomorrow is already a different day. Next year was already a different topic that is a controversial in the community. Next year, we already have a different environment, all the way from politics to progress to, you know, um, now with all this digital era that we into that, COVID as an example, you saw clearly, we were living through COVID, but you can see now from one day to the next how history changed dramatically. And so it's not, to me, I see history as a one big circle, a circle of us remembering and preserving as much as we can, but also not just the past, but the present, because that is the future, and how the future is going to be looking back at the present and the past. And so now there is a very interesting conversation that I've been having lately with the changes in urban planning and the demographics that are taking place. It's like I keep telling people, we are not LA, we are not New York, we are not all those mega cities that have time to adjust to these transformations all at once. You look at it like your family, you are here, you know your community, you invest in your community. So of course you want to protect it. Of course you want to make sure that, it continues to grow and continues to thrive the way you envision it from the beginning. But then we have this other migration coming in, and it's disrupting that plan. It's disrupting what the ideal was. And we're talking about it less than 100 years, how dramatic the changes has been. And so for the mega cities, they already have many generations in adaptation. Let's just say New York. There already been, different migrations that took place. There's already been conversations about how do we become more diverse and inclusive and all that. So there's already been an ongoing conversation on that one. Here we are right next to Seattle, where is this mega city in a really short term. I mean, it was like one day it was okay, and the next day, boom, it just exploded. And so with that explosion comes with not just the economic growth, but it's also the population and all the side effects that comes with it, including migration. And so when you have this massive cultural shock taking place on both places, from the residents that have the families, but also from the ones that are arriving and now they're trying to call it home. What is home? And it's a really hard, sensitive conversation, and it's an ongoing battle internally that I've witnessed throughout the years now, more than 20 years in the field, where even like last night I was at the on Heritage Day in Olympia, and we're talking about with all the different museums around the state, and how interesting that conversation is. Once again, they are not Seattle, like especially in the eastern side of the state, they are not Seattle. And so the context of living history right now is completely different than what we experience in here in Highline area, right next to a mega city, and right from a place where it has a really more of a town mentality, blending with the urban city mentality. So there's a really unique situation that we're going through right now. So going back to demographics, what is history? What's community? What's home? What makes you you? It's such a basic questions, but when you ask that to so many people, you realize that you get complete different answers and complete different views. Some people would like to call it social justice. Some people would like to call it a sense of belonging. Some people would like to call it preservation of a local history. And at the end of the day, it comes down to, are we talking to each other? Are we actually co-sharing the space in a way that is healthy for all of us, in a way that matches with our values? We have more things in common than differences. I tend to talk a lot. I'll slow down on my talking. This is your interview.
No, I think there's something to that. And, 100 years ago, my family was welcomed here, and I always try and remember that and hope that we continue to be welcoming to the next generation that comes here and that needs a home. I think that, like you're saying, we find ourselves, Seattle Pacific Northwest has, for the last 100 years, been largely fastly growing, with a couple of exceptions, like, the Boeing downturn in the past. But generally, this has been a very fast growing part of this continent. We are particularly been facing that the last a decade or two. Seattle was, consistently in the top fastest growing cities in the country, most cranes, building cranes in the country. How do we, what is our obligation to the next generation, to people who want to move here today? What, the benefits that we got, how much do we pass that on? Every expert will tell you, every economist will tell you that we are very much short on housing in the Puget Sound region. We need another 100,000 to 200,000 Otherwise, we are just not going to be keeping up with the demand. And we see that everyone knows there's rising housing costs. Everyone is obviously aware of homelessness in our communities. And you see it again in other, fast-growing cities, these same similar problems, but, ours are our own. How do we make room? And then as part of that, if you get down to the micro level of, so let's say we agree that we need to be building more housing, that we need to be making space for everyone who wants to come here, wants to be part of our community and build with us, and who is already here. How do we do that without physically displacing? How do you build more housing without physically removing the people who are currently living in the housing that already exists? This is the balance. And if we're not having these conversations, I think we are all going to get left out in the hopes of some perfect solution. But this is a unique challenge that we face now. How are we going to ensure that our community is being built to accommodate everyone and to accommodate the future?
I don't think and I speak no as a museum or I speak as a person. I don't think it's possible to accommodate everyone. Everyone is different, but I think that what unifies the mission, because it's a mission to represent and to cultivate and to serve, is to have those values. Why are we doing this? What are the goals? What are we heading? What do we want to do? We all want a healthy community. We want to feel safe. We want to feel like we belong. We want to make sure that we have a safe environment for the kids, and we have good schools, and we have clean streets, and we don't have crimes, and we have a way that we can survive and thrive as a community. I think all of us have that in common. All of us have the need to be in a place where we can thrive, and the ever goal of being happy, what that means.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think it's important to remember that we got here together. We're going to get to the future together. We need to not look at any single issue as a zero sum or the final. And remember that we're going to continue to have repeat interactions with each other as a community and into the future. And how do we build institutions that allow us to build together and also to manage our disagreements? We are all going to disagree. We're going to have an election every year, and there will be disagreements that will feel very divisive, and that will be divisive. But how do we build institutions, both literal and cultural and symbolic, that allow us to navigate these disputes and these discussions and these hard decisions that we have to work on?
yeah, think about as a family. Have you ever met a family who is functional? Have you ever met, I mean, maybe yours is, and I'm trying to say, but I just know that even as a loving family with the same values, living in the same house, every single family member have their own mindset and what's right, what's wrong, and personalities, defense mechanisms, and so we have that element that even as simple as, okay, what's home to you, everyone will give a completely different answer. But we got a few minutes left, and I want to be respectful. And so we got 5 minutes. Anything else that would you like to share before we end the interview? Anything about you or your work and anything?
I think I'll take the 5 minutes to plug the museum, actually. If you're listening to this, I'm sure you're familiar with our work and the work that Nancy does here.
We do.
And all the volunteers who have made this all possible and community members. If you're not a museum member currently, I strongly encourage you to sign up. We offer very affordable deals, especially for family groups. I know I have a family plan membership. We have events constantly that you're not going to want to miss, our rotating exhibits. Not to mention, it's just a kind of a fun place to be when people come through. So please join the museum board and volunteer if you can. We have all sorts of great volunteer opportunities. We could always use someone to help sit at the front desk even.
Absolutely.
A great way to meet your neighbors because people are constantly coming through. And just, whether or not you've lived here for a month, a day, or 100 years, don't forget that this is your community now. Don't be afraid to be a part of it, and don't be afraid to welcome others into it as well.
Oh, it's so beautiful. Yay. Now you see why he is our board president. He passed those messages, and absolutely, there's so many opportunities for us to grow. And as you notice, a lot of events are free. But that's not always going to be like that. Right now, we're really trying to find the right formula between serving a low-income families and making it accessible, and to write the museum by saying, yes, we are here for real. We are serving the community versus bringing some money in to truly thrive. And so you support either as a volunteer, community partnership, even participant helps. You attendance helps. Why? Because it's reinforcing those values that we are here for one purpose: build the community and preserve as many stories in our past and our history as possible. And so we cannot do it with you. It's the opposite. It's you. It's about you, and then you sharing about who you are. And today it was about Austin sharing who he is. And I just hope that this is one interview, many, hopefully, that we can record and preserve more of his histories. This is not only serving one generation. Think about like, okay, what are we doing in 100 years, 200 years, 300 years? And this is just the early generation of the history of this area. And so we're just building the foundation. And so we need you to feel comfortable feeling that this is you and this is about you and for all of us together as a community. So once again, thank you, Austin, for this interview. And to everyone, and just happy to hopefully have you back in the next one. Okay. Bye. Bye.
Our Highline Voices, 106.5 KQWZ LP FM.
We envision ourselves sitting at a round table where no one is the leader and stories are heard respectfully, regardless of gender, age, sexual orientation, disabilities, or ethnicity. We want to embrace our differences and similarities. We are creating a place where visitors can connect with the stories and each other. Our mission is we collect, preserve, and tell the stories of the Highline region and its people. We want to extend our mission outside the walls of the museum. Our Highline Voices represents us all, honoring our past, celebrating our present, and uniting to cultivate our future. This project allows us to reach out to demographics who might be unable to visit the museum. People with disabilities, low-income families, people who don't trust museums, and more. In partnership, we are launching a locally programmed new radio station at the museum, featuring recorded and live Highline's heritage, history, culture, arts, and more. Are you interested in sharing your story? Email director@highlinemuseum.org.